Hello everyone, we are with Mr. Amir Abdulla today, Deputy Executive Director of World Food Programme, for a discussion as part of World Humanitarian Forum's digital series to discuss the role of World Food Programme in times of COVID-19 and understand the challenges. Mr. Abdullah, welcome to the World Humanitarian Forum's digital series. And I would like to start with asking you the first question. How is World Food Programme supporting the COVID-19 response globally, be it support to the larger humanitarian community or support to national government? What is World Food Programme doing?
Well, first of all, thanks for inviting World Food Programme to be part of your series. I mean, I think what we have to start off with is the impact that COVID-19 is having on everybody, everything. I mean, this is truly global in its nature, and there isn't any facet, if we actually look at our own individual personal lives, how they've been impacted. And that impact is being felt almost, let's say, in a magnified manner by whether it's the supply chains that are very vulnerable, that WFP relies on and WFP's partners rely on, whether it's more importantly and in particular, the lives of the many beneficiaries and recipients of whether it's World Food Programme's assistance, NGOs' assistance, other UN agencies' assistance, even government's own bilateral social protection programs. All of these are being impacted because of the conditions under which they have to operate, the conditions under which the people they're trying to reach and serve have to live. So, you know, it's almost really difficult to describe the magnitude that of the impact. Having said that, the World Food Programme, you know, we're pretty well known for rising to a crisis, rising to a challenge. And we're basically, I would say, supporting in three key ways. One is the impact that this is having on those that we already serve, who are people who are food insecure all around the globe. All of the countries we work in are impacted. The governments and host nations that we work in and their programs, what kind of assistance can we give to them, whether it's technical capacity or physical support, logistical support. And then we have been called upon to also help keep supply chains and open, also to help where capacities are falling short. WFP is providing logistic support to the supply chains of the humanitarian world, development world, and very importantly at this critical time, the health chains that have to move. So we're working there not in isolation, although many of us are sort of almost living in self-isolation, but we are working very much with partners, particularly WHO, but also all other UN partners and NGOs. And then it's about moving goods into locations, but also people, humanitarian and development and health workers are finding it difficult to get to the locations they need to. People who are already there, who are working under difficult conditions, are finding it difficult to get out and take a break and go back. So we have sort of set up and are working within the humanitarian system on an air service that's not only cargo, but also passenger. But of course, that's what we do within the system. But our prime objective is to ensure that the very much needed direct assistance programs that we have they're not overly impacted, and the people that we serve, that we help alleviate the pressures they're under, and recognize that there will be new ones. And as you know, many of the places that we work prior to COVID were already impacted, whether it was by weather conditions, droughts and floods, conflict. If you think of the Horn of Africa, where they're having to deal with that, plus locusts, plus COVID. So, you know, the world had many challenges, and the people we serve were facing so many challenges that when you overlay COVID on top of it, I would say, in a nutshell, we're trying to make sure that that doesn't become the straw that breaks the camel's back.
Thank you. It was a great explanation to help people understand what WFP is doing. I would like to ask you about the May External Situation Report. It projects that 130 million people in low to middle income countries will likely be driven into severe hunger this year from the socioeconomic fallout the COVID-19 pandemic will bring, including heavy job losses and a drastic reduction in remittances. Can you paint a picture of what is happening on the ground at a regional and global level? What is the situation?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think those numbers are not exaggerated. I mean, they are backed up by fairly detailed assessments. But I mean, I think to start with, you only have to look at the ILO's numbers when they talk about potentially up to 80% of the world's workforce being impacted one way or another. And 1.6 billion jobs, was it, that that are potentially affected, if not lost. So people who were in work and providing for themselves, and you've mentioned remittances, often not only in work for themselves, but often as sole supporters of people in many vulnerable countries, remittances and things like that not going. So the impact, the socioeconomic impact, really can't be understated. The Secretary General's report really does give some very, very sobering background on that. But I'd mentioned when I opened about the impact in the Horn of Africa. I mean, if you already take the weather conditions that they have had to suffer, put the conflict, and then with the potential for a locust swarms not under control because of weather conditions and conflict conditions, and that impacting the meager food security that was going to be there. And then when you put COVID over that, I think the Horn of Africa, whether you're talking Somalia, Kenya, South Sudan, Ethiopia, Eritrea, they are all going to be potentially impacted by all of the points I just mentioned. So there we're seeing, and we already had large numbers of people there who were marginally ready to fall into a classification that would have put them as extremely food insecure. But it's not restricted to that. I mean, the Sahel, where we have struggled for many years to try and build up people's resilience, has, the type of conflict that you've got going in the Sahel has meant that the capacity to build up people's resilience to what will be weather, we can't stop the next drought there, but what we could stop is people falling into severe hunger or, heaven forbid, famine conditions because we build up their resilience. That resilience that you can build up depends on people being able to undertake work and lively work, which is impacted by the COVID response, because they could provide to market for people to buy. But if people in the marketplace don't have purchase power because they've lost their jobs because of the COVID conditions, those sort of sustenance farmers who've just managed to get a little bit of extra produce are finding that there's nowhere to sell it, so that's even before the COVID impacts on them. It's on what would have been their customer base. So our resilience efforts and efforts to build up resilience in the Sahel, which is really the only long-term sustainable solution to having repeated crisis after crisis, was already, as I said, a very difficult job to do in the conflict zone. But then you put on top of it the loss of purchasing power because of COVID. And staying on the continent and going down to the southern areas, southern Africa, there we were really starting to feel quite let's say, optimistic. The conflicts had abated. There was a spirit of you were able to start building up people's resilience. People were asset creation, people was, real livelihood work was beginning. But suddenly again, and exactly for the reasons I just mentioned about the loss of purchase power in markets, means that the people that primarily are our, let's say, I want a better term, clientele, but those that we're serving are invariably people who'll be working as smallholder farmers or producers. And if there was nowhere for them to go to sell, or there were no people, purchasing power was dropping, we fall to that. But this isn't restricted to, Africa has always been one of our main areas of attention, and with our highest number of beneficiaries. But, if you go eastwards from there, what's happening, particularly in Yemen and around Syria, where we'd had difficulty with as rising of the conflict and whether it's internally displacement or the refugee crisis that's going on there, programs that were already very difficult to manage are now, in a sense, COVID impacted, because we've taken many measures to ensure that where we're doing either food distribution or cash distribution, that we've implemented measures that mean that we don't have people too concentrated, or use measures that they don't have to stay there too long. But when you need to do identification, registration, monitoring, assessment, which really relies on contact with people, those things become more difficult at a time of COVID. We've got used to all having to wear masks or personal protection, but that in a sense also creates a bit of a divide between you and the community you're trying to serve. So we've always believed that we need to be there. So those type, so and moving into other parts of Asia, the similar sort of, I would say, impact that we're seeing in Southern Africa. And then moving westwards from Africa, this is, it's not like the Americas have not been affected. And there I'm talking in particular the work that we do in Central America, but also parts of Southern America. We already had migration and refugee crisis rising out of the Venezuela situation, but also the dry corridor in Central America and the potential for migration of people are very dispersed. And many of them were either trying to move northwards, or they're being supported already by somebody that had moved northwards. And those are some of the remittances, the job loss in the US. Many of the people who've lost those temporary work were people who had actually migrated from Central America or Southern America. And as they've lost their jobs, not only has their livelihood been lost, but their remittance back home has been lost. So I think probably impacted by the labor force in, whilst, clearly what's happening in the United States is of worry for the United States. But from our perspective, the impact of the loss of remittances back to places in Central America is going to have a major impact on people's ability to purchase. So we're seeing, I would say, a rise in requests from countries in that region. We have within WFP, we have something called the IRA, which is our immediate response account, which is when we introduce emergency funding before we can get to donors to actually start providing. We've had to activate that recently for Peru, for now for El Salvador and Ecuador, and those were countries that we, up to now, we've really had our programs, in a sense, moving in the other direction, moving more towards longer term resilience, building up people's capacity. So, to say this is a global pandemic, it certainly is. We know it's a global health crisis, but what we are seeing from our perspective is that global health crisis, unless we're able to really all get out there together and do something about it, we have the risk of it becoming a global food crisis. And we are starting to see that in places. And, our executive director has been very vocal about letting the world know that, if we don't deal with that part of it, the next pandemic could well be a food pandemic.
There is a plague of locusts which has impacted millions of people from Ethiopia to Pakistan. FAO estimated that in Pakistan alone there will be a loss of £2 billion worth of winter crops alone, with the price of flour and vegetables going up by 15%. This lack of food security has been exacerbated by the COVID crisis. Which steps must member states and the international community take to protect the most vulnerable?
I mean, I think with the locust crisis, we're working very closely with our Rome-based partner, FAO, the Food Agricultural Organization. And really, at this stage in the crisis, it's very important that they are supported in the work that they're doing in locust control. So we often say that, really helping them with locust control will really help us not have to deal with a food crisis. So I think, number one is where, member states really should give what support they can to our sister agency, FAO, for their locust control and battling the locusts. We work with them where we can on assisting with our logistics support, but they're very, this is something they've done for many years, so they know what to do. It's getting the resources to do it. They also are impacted by the conflict elements, because some of the areas, you were talking about the locust swarms moving off through Yemen towards Pakistan and everything, but they will have swarmed from places potentially in the Horn. So we, and dealing with the locusts at that level is exacerbated or made difficult by conflict. Having said that, clearly it is not going to be fully under control. So what we need to do is, and we're working together with FAO on that, is already have assessments of areas that unfortunately may well be impacted, a bit like the numbers and areas that you've just mentioned. And I would say there are going to be some elements of that where there are countries in which the assistance of financing such as can be provided by World Bank or IMF, so that governments can really implement their own safety mechanisms, are going to be ones that we welcome and support. We recognize that, in a sense, what WFP deals with is often the residual vulnerable that can't be managed by those mechanisms. So this is going to be very large and is going to need those kind of solutions. So we would urge member states to really help with those solutions. And then for the World Food Programme, I think what we will be doing is, we will be assessing what I would call, the residual very vulnerable layer, the ones who really are going to fall outside of those safety nets. We have to have the capacities to build our safety net so that we can deal with that. And for that, we will need donor support. And the thing with these, as with, locust swarms, we have rough ideas where they will go, but they can move, or they can, so we may well end up with the impact not being exactly in the country that we first foresaw, or we may find that it's more severe in one area than another. So this is one element where a degree of flexible funding from donors is very useful. We always talk about multilateral funding be an ability to move, have funding follow a crisis more quickly rather than waiting for the crisis. If you've got the funding available, you can generally start sooner. So I think what it is going to be difficult, but all of these, I would say, challenges are ones that there are solutions for. But those solutions invariably require a degree of resourcing and financial support that is going to be difficult to guarantee, because we do understand that many of the countries and that are donor nations who support many of these programs are actually facing, economic challenges of their own. The financial hardships that, the things that they have to now deal with, donor countries have to deal with at home, is going to be an impact or a potential impact on funding that's available for humanitarian donors to prescribe to other countries. So I would say my plea is that, at this time of their own difficulty, they understand and realize that if they're facing difficulties like that, can they imagine what the difficulty is like for people who started off from a much worse place?
Thank you so much. My next question is about another strategy that WFP might apply. Many organizations highlight the importance of articulated action within the local actors and communities. Does this strategy apply to World Food Program? And how can extremely vulnerable communities build resilience and plan for food shortages? How can the international community help local actors be better prepared?
The World Food Program, to get the reach that we do, we rely very heavily on working, with partners that work with us on the ground, and many of them are community-based partners in the countries that we serve. I think if you're going to get really good, sound resilience building programs, they have to be community-based. So we work, and some of the best community-based projects that I've seen within WFP are actually in the Sahel, but also in Latin America. So we've got the experience of working with community-based organizations, whether they be local farmer organizations or just, I would say, community run small schools where we have school meals programs or health centers. So those are things that really kick up. Then also, if you use, in the Sahel, we've got something called an integrated resilience Sahel program. And there it's about not only helping people produce more food, but finding the market for them to sell it, often within the schools, that then it becomes part of an education program or a health program. So all of those can only really work if you're working at grassroots level with the community. So we recognize that. So, but what more needs to be done is, I think we as WFP, but also others, need to find a way to transfer resources to those communities faster. Sometimes we and I think we probably, others face the same challenges that we do. We don't necessarily transfer resource as quickly as we would like to. And these are not, many of these community-based programs, they're so small that you're worried about taking the financial risk of advancing funds, whatever. So there's always a little bit of a securities issue, as is it financially secure? But I think we have to, all of us, to help those programs take off properly, is increase our risk appetite and actually accept that not every single one will succeed. And yes, we may have one or two community programs that either fail or worse. But in order to help the many others succeed, we have to be able to take a little bit of risk. So I think what I would say is, our own program, but other international organizations who want to really help community-based organizations move up, we have to take maybe sometimes a little bit of a leap of faith, take a risk, and sometimes it's going to be a financial risk, because they themselves are not large enough to sort of have the wherewithal to manage their own advances or own financing or get loans. So, which is why I think some of the programs that work on microcredit schemes, and we work very closely with our other own partner, the International Fund for Agricultural Development, IFAD, who specialize in that. And I think those are areas that, I think need support. And I might sound like I'm advocating support for everybody but WFP. WFP, and I don't want that to sound like that, but we know that for WFP to really reduce the numbers of people in crisis that we have to serve, then other partners need to actually get the resources and step up. And we have a very wide footprint on the ground. We have many partners we work with, so we're happy to use those in a different style. But really, at the end of the day, it's going to be finding a way to transfer resources to community-based organizations so they really have the capacities and the potential to do what they, and at the end of the day, we have found out they're the ones who have the answers. They're the ones who know what they need. And I think, what international organizations may be slightly guilty of is we think we know the solutions to people's problems before we've even really understood what the problem is. So we bring what we think is our solution to their problem. And what happens, at best, it's just not the solution. At worst is the solutions we bring create new problems. And that's something I think we all need to be very, very mindful of and recognize that communities are not living in that desperate time because that's what they want to do. It's because they haven't had the capacity to get out of it. So let's ask them, find out what do they need to get out of it, and then that's what we should provide.
Great. WFP is delivering greatly in the ground, and we had the chance to monitor it very closely. So congratulations on the work that you have been doing very, very well. I would like to ask you about the interconnectedness a little bit. You mentioned that you have programs with the schools. Food security, rather than a constrained topic, it is expressed and it involves many other issues of international concern. With COVID-19, the interconnectedness of issues such as gender, education, and hunger are highlighted. WFP has always tried to make this connection known. For instance, in many countries around the world, as you mentioned, many children only eat while they are in school. Without that structure, many are going hungry. How is WFP providing support for the most vulnerable while chains of supply and traditional forms of reaching people has changed within the current context? What are the lessons learned for the future of humanitarian action?
First, let me pick up on the school meals issue, because that clearly is something we're very concerned about. So many of our school meals programs are impacted because children aren't in school. Now, we hope they're headed on their way back to school, but we also recognize that they can only go back when it's safe to do so. So we have in many, many countries, especially where we have felt that school children would be very, very vulnerable, have found mechanisms that they are either a take-home ration distributed through the school system, or reaching the people with the children who would have been at school through a different distribution mechanism. So we've sort of recognized that although people many of our partners are trying to keep the education side going, even though they may not be in the classroom. So we're working with them too, to sort of, if there's any way we can use the food to help them with that part of it. But we recognize that this is an impact. And you mentioned the interconnectedness, but we really have recognized that if you get school, I've always said, if you have a gender-sensitive, nutrition-focused school meals program, you can deal with food security and nutrition and hit SDG 2. You can assist with the gender inequity issues because you're focusing with the girls, so you can hit SDG 5. You can help people with their health, so you're hitting SDG 3, the education SDG 4. It's a walking SDG mechanism, so it's certainly interconnected. So those programs are ones that we've really been pushing, but they're obviously going to be impacted when you get a break either in the supply or a break in the program. So, this interconnectedness of things really it's shown there's all the positive aspects that I've just mentioned, but then all the risks. When one part of that interconnectedness falls down, so many other things are impacted as well. We've recognized that supply chains need to be end to end, and any chain, it's always said any chain is only as strong as the weakest link. So what are the lessons we've learned, and what are the things that we as WFP, but I would say as the humanitarian community, need to do as a learning from this crisis, is go back and it's not just like, we often think of supply chain as just the, from our perspective, very much of getting goods or mainly food one end to end. But much of what we do, because of the interconnectedness, is a form of chain. So what we need to do is really look at it and work out where's the weakest link in that chain and strengthen there, sort of start from there. Because if you try and sort of just, pick it, go end to end without really identifying how this interconnectedness works and where's the weakness and where will the break come, and go and fix or strengthen the break before the tension comes on the chain. Because if you wait until it drains, it will break at the weakest link. So that is what we all need to do. Now, from a WFP perspective, invariably that's working with communities, as we've just said. It's working with governments, it's working with transporters, freight forwarders, to actually understand how the supply chain, for us, are very much a supply chain mechanism works. But I would say many of our partners have different kinds of chains because of that interconnectedness. And what we've seen, what I think the COVID crisis has shown us, is where the breaks have occurred, and that's regrettable. I mean, we have had breakdowns. I think all of us have had breakdowns in many of our programs. So we should reflect, look back, find out why, and go back and strengthen those. So, we need to, we found also that, before we came into this, people were looking at, well, how do we actually manage work by having people in different conditions? And people came into this with the assumption that no, to really work we all need to be together. We can't have a meeting unless we're all together, or there's a conference going on, or there's a meeting in New York, a 2-day meeting or a 1-day meeting, so we have to travel halfway around the globe to just attend it. But we're actually finding today we're attending those things. I mean, we're using, whether it's Microsoft Teams, Zoom, Skype, you can name every platform that's out there. I mean, I think on any one day I go to 6 different meetings on 4 different platforms. So and we're all becoming very adept at that. So that was something that before this crisis we would not have believed possible. So I think when we come out of this, our own behaviors should adapt like that. But we should look back at our programs, see which ones have broken down, where did they break down, why, and then go back and fix that before the next time.
Thank you for such a stimulating conversation. I have so many questions to ask to you further, but I don't want to take too much time of yours. I have one more last question. You mentioned about partners and SDGs. It's going to be about that. WFP has recently made a joint statement with FAO, the World Bank and IFAD, where you emphasize the need for collective action to drive transformative action and contribute to the UN Decade of Action to deliver the SDGs by 2030. Let's talk about these partnerships and the need to deliver on the SDGs. What is the state of play, and how can the international community articulate better to meet the needs?
Yeah, I think, what we need to start with is, the SDGs and Agenda 2030 was an incredibly visionary ideal. But it was more than a visionary ideal. It was actually a commitment. Governments all around the world signed up to these goals. So there's a commitment of the global community to reach it. Now here we are, 2020. We have got a decade of action ahead of us if we're going to achieve the goals by 2030. I think the realists recognize that not every target in every goal is going to be achieved by 2030. But that doesn't mean that we don't make the biggest push that we can through the decade of action to get as close as possible. We recognize that the whole premise was on leave no one behind and start with the furthest behind first. And you know, for WFP, furthest behind first is basically our ethos. It's, I would say, you know, it almost summarizes WFP's approach. But WFP alone could never, you know, manage that. So you need the type of partnerships that call that, because what you bring together there are the commitment and will of each of those individual organizations, but you bring technical skills and capacities. You bring microfinancing, you bring macrofinancing. You know, you got World Bank and IFAD, you've got micro and macro financing opportunities. You've got, you know, and with the technical expertise that comes through from FAO, you know, combining all that at a grassroots level with the most vulnerable communities, who are basically the people we know well, you've got a possibility to actually tackle, you know, the goals. And I think because of what we were saying, the interconnectedness of things, whilst we will always come at things in a sense with an SDG 2 lens, because for us, the entry point is a food security or a nutrition issue. So we'll have an SDG 2 lens. But quite honestly, if you're tackling health and education and gender issues and reducing conflict in some places, making sure you don't impact the climate, you're improving the land, you're improving the sea, at the end, you're reducing poverty to a great extent. You know, you're hitting SDGs 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I'm sure we did some water and sanitation in there, so I can throw in 6. And then, you know, you got the 13, 14, 15, you got the climate, the land, the sea, or the conflict on 16. We're all big partners together. 17. I mean, you know, so it's like a walking, the commitment behind that as we go through the decade of action is almost like a walking SDG solution machine. And I think, you know, where we, as we said earlier, the interconnectedness of things means that anybody who thinks they can just look at one SDG and solve it will nothing, you know, because if that had actually been our objective, that you can look at one and forget it, quite honestly, we probably could have just had SDG 1. If we solved global poverty, you could almost argue that 2 to 17 will fall into place. So you know, but you're not going to deal with the issues that come under SDG 1 without picking up on 2 to 16. And if you're not partners, you need, you know, that's why you need 17. So that is why in this interconnected world, you need these coalitions of different groups with a focus in a certain area. But it's only through those coalitions of many that you can deal with something as large as Agenda 2030. We've got a decade. We need a lot of action. We may not meet every target in every goal, but if we do it right, we'll be a lot closer to the finishing line than we are today.
Thank you so much. Any parting words and any last message you want to leave to all our listeners and to the community?
Not really. I think, you know, we've touched so many different aspects. I think what I really would just say is that these are huge issues. We need to deal with it together. You know, we particularly as a World Humanitarian Forum, a group of people who focus on humanitarian issues, we need to recognize that there will continue to be humanitarian crises as long as we don't get communities to build up their resilience, build up things. So let us accept the language that's in the Agenda 2030. Let's really embrace the nexus. Let's recognize that, you know, humanitarian workers, development workers, we need to work with other. COVID is showing us that, you know, humanitarian development, health workers, we're all working in this together. So the real thing is, the challenge ahead of us is so large that this is something that we only do together. And I'd just like to say that we at WFP welcome our partners. And with this, I hope that we will do it together. So thank you for having us on your program today.
Thank you so much for all the contribution that you have provided. It was a great conversation, and we look forward to the next one. I still have too many questions to ask you.
Okay, well, you think the questions up and we'll do it another time.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Okay, bye for now.